Hey friends, how's it going? So I saw this video the other day, someone tagged me in it. It's super funny. We're gonna go through it. This guy's named Simon Dan. He's a cheeky young British chap who's got some really strong opinions about something I don't really think he knows anything about. Anyway, Simon Dan seems to be one of these fans of his elementary school education that was forced down his throat when he was too young to critically think. Anyway, let's get going.
One of the more stranger conspiracies that we've looked at in the past was the mud floods. The idea that an entire civilization was buried by a miraculous mud flood, completely obliterating any evidence that they ever existed.
Simon Dan likes to use straw men. This isn't really at all what any of these people are trying to say, but if you spent zero time researching it, this is the conclusion you'd probably come to.
Or did it?
Oh, well, at least he did that.
Hello all and welcome along to another episode of Tin 4 Tuesday with me, Simon Dan. Thank you very much for joining me. Before we begin today, I just want to point you in the direction. Places that you can find. Levi and his 80,000 subscribers are going to give us a history lesson on the Tartarian mud flood reset. Here we go, people.
To context, John Levy is a researcher on YouTube. He puts a very great amount of effort into staying unbiased and simply presenting things, presenting speculations. Some seem very silly, and some seem very reasonable, and some seem very mainstream, but he goes all over the place. He most definitely isn't saying that any of these things he's saying are facts, or that he has concrete, definitive evidence to prove any of these things. We're simply speculating here. We're simply, with an open mind, doing research and looking at history and going, does that really make any sense? You know, or like, what's going on here? Instead of just believing, as if it's a fact, everything fed to us by the powers that be.
On a lot of different topics, on all these different channels. Oh, mostly based on the past and what happened in our past. What happened to the past civilization? Why weren't we told about it? And is the past going to repeat itself?
Why weren't we told about it? Well, I'm fairly sure that we know our history pretty well.
Oh!
How do you know about this? And mainstream history does not.
History is written by the victor, homie. History is a bunch of statements, a bunch of false statements agreed upon. Sorry, I fucked that up. But anyway, what are you talking about? I'm pretty sure we know about our history. Yeah, no, bro. Sorry. So yeah. Again, like I said earlier, he's obviously someone who believes everything that was taught to him in the government indoctrination center called the school, elementary school that we went to. Holy crap. So this guy, basically by what he just said, says we know everything perfectly. Don't pay attention to any of this. Don't research any of this. We know everything. Fallacy.
So many
Fallacy,
angles
fallacy.
and clues, and we could consider Tartaria. Tartaria shown on so many different maps from the past, and always leaving us to consider, were these respected map makers such as Ortelius and Mercator simply madmen, along with countless others, depicting this nation or empire or simply people of Tartaria?
The problem here is that all of those maps are showing Tartaria looking quite different.
Maps from the past always looked different. They had different people using them, different countries using them, different explorers drawing them down. We didn't have airplanes with GPS and satellites flying around taking pictures of all this stuff to have these perfect maps back in the day, dill hole.
Tartaria was a blanket term used by Europeans for parts of Asia between the Caspian Sea and the Pacific Ocean in the west.
Wait a minute. Let me see this. I'm pretty sure that's the straight first statement on Wikipedia. I know that by heart. So, yeah.
So technically it was an area in the world, an area that had Tartarian people. But like a lot of empires, they fall for a lot of many different reasons, and new regimes take hold.
Yeah, but the problem about Tartaria is that there's zero information out there about how it fell. Really, any information that it even existed at all. It was a huge, huge superpower, and yet we're not told about it in the least bit. If you Google a lot of Tartarian stuff, you'll find a lot of negative stigma attached to the word Tartaria, and a lot of like propaganda, you know, like a propaganda things where you're like, why are they trying to do that? They're trying to like, basically, it looks like history is being wiped clean of the Tartarians. That's why it's so interesting and we're looking at it, not because you can just go on Google and find out everything, all the facts about Tartaria.
And whether one is to believe that this people ruled all throughout this realm, or just select to the regions of Central Asia, moving west, north and east.
It's highly unlikely that the Tartarians had control of the known world back then.
The idea that...
Care to articulate why? You're just going to show up and make that statement? Dude, you're not using science very well, bro. Like, if you're a Sci-Man Dan, I think you'd have some sort of scientific, concrete proof, not just your statement that you don't think that's possible.
We were
Holy
never
crap.
taught of these people, and that they seem to have been erased from our history, is enough reason to say that these people in this part of the puzzle matters. Who were these people? How did they live? And why is this knowledge being kept from us?
Well, I would argue that it isn't. A simple Google search throws up a tremendous amount of articles and websites that delve extensively into the history of the Tartarian Empire.
Really? Because when I go on Google, I see basically the same statement you already made about from Wikipedia plastered all over everything that has to do with Tartaria. There's no information about Tartaria. Yeah, you can see the word Tartarian Empire and Tartaria if you Google it, but you're not getting the full picture, and that's why we're here. We're doing more research. There's nothing wrong with that.
Now, I'm sure by now many of you have seen the CIA document talking about this exact subject, the erasing of Tartaria in history, and not actually done by the CIA, but the CIA simply having commentary on the subject in a memo that I believe was now declassified, and many question the authenticity of this document, but nonetheless, very interesting.
And if you actually look at that document, you will see that the reason Tartarian history was rewritten was to eliminate references of Russian aggressions. Not a surprise, that one.
What is that, some like jab at Russia or something? Well, I don't know.
And what about the reset?
I don't know if that matters.
Does the reset really matter? And what is the reset? The reset is an idea that we...
I can't help but have to mention how reasonable John Levy's being. He's basically asking questions for both sides. He's just talking, he's giving the answers of why it's important that we like speculate and look into this history and figure out what was going on, because it probably, you know, will answer some sort of other questions we're asking about history. Yet this condescending douchebag, is like telling us not to. It's not worth looking at this
clues
stuff. Like
of past and much more magnificent civilizations than our own existing as little as 200 to 400 years ago, based on the architecture and layouts of our cities and forts, which in past times were called bastion forts and what we call star forts, existing all throughout this realm. Things that we can't replicate today, and really not being hidden at all, just given ridiculous stories on how they were created.
Star forts were designed in that way to deflect cannonballs, which was a primary weapon in that time. That makes sense. Now, not so much of a primary weapon, are they?
So, this one's really funny. So, what's the point? Like, if you're the leader of an army and you're attacking a fort, right? Are you gonna shoot at the walls in front of you that are the hardest part of the building, or are you gonna shoot over the wall and hit the structures on the inside that are softer? That statement he just made no sense whatsoever. And another interesting thing that is another sub rabbit hole of the Tartarian reset is cannons and their actual the lack of performance that cannons have. There is zero footage of cannons being used successfully in war. There are tons of footage. There's tons of pictures of blown apart cannons on battlefields, though. I have an anecdote. I used to work on tall ships. My dad was a sea captain. We'd work on these period proper tall ships that are like pirate ships, and we had cannons, and I would work with the cannons, and we'd take people out, shoot the cannons, and have sword fights and stuff. It was really fun. But we also had real cannonballs, and when we didn't have public on board and we were out sailing somewhere, we would usually get some pallets and we'd strap them all together and we would send it out and we would shoot at it with the cannons. We had some medium-sized cannons and some smaller-sized cannons, and we were always absolutely dumbfounded by how bad, how much they lacked power and range and aim. You couldn't hit anything. If you did hit something, like the ball would fly, it would be all wham, and the ball would fly out and just go thunk, and or it would bounce a couple times, 20 yards from the boat. Cannons were mostly a psychological weapon in the past. They're like old traditional cannons. They were repurposed technology that was repurposed into a psychological weapon to scare people, much like nuclear weapons these days. Something made up, and basically, a boogeyman that's made up. Cannons. And then the other thing about these star forts and the fact that they put cannons all over them is that the powers that be need us knowing, they really need us to know that, or to think that humanity is inherently evil and that we always have fought with each other. We've never in history got along, which is absolute bullshit. They need us thinking that humans are just evil and they just fight each other and look at the chimps and all this garbage. When it's really not true. So selling the star forts, these star forts are found all over the world. They are not only in the U.S. The ones in the U.S. look exactly like the ones in freaking Russia and Europe and in Britain, and they have these star forts everywhere. And in the U.S., many of our big cities are built around these star forts. Look into it. You can go find them. You can literally find them on the map because of how they're laid out. But anyway, yeah, so they say, oh, these were all made in the Civil War, and then you have this monument to the Civil War that always is going to remind everyone that humanity kills each other, brother against brother, killed each other to save the slaves, and this BS story that they're given because of the Civil War. So anyway, this dill hole thinking that the actual structure of a fort is meant to stop cannonballs. Like, that doesn't make any sense. You don't shoot the oh God.
And in modern times, being repurposed for many different things, one being the pedestal for our Statue of Liberty.
Aesthetic reasons.
No, it's actually a star fort. It's made out of something here. Since this guy's giving basically no information, I'm going to give you guys some cool little rabbit holes to look into. The base of the Statue of Liberty is made out of something called Rosendale cement. Rosendale cement, aka natural cement, aka Roman cement. This cement formula was unknown for the past 100 years. The only structures in this country built out of natural cement are Capitol buildings and Capitol monuments in almost all the states in the U.S. Sacramento, even, on the West Coast, was made out of this natural cement. This story is really cool. So there's a Fort Jefferson. Fort Jefferson is this giant brick and mortar fort off the coast of Florida that is very old, way older than they say it is. But anyway, they started restoring it, and they have this contractor who's like a world famous monument restorer who goes to restore Fort Jefferson, and he's like, what is this shit it's built out of? He has no clue what the mortar is or what it's made out of, that this entire building is made out of. So he takes some of it, reverse engineers it, he tries to find out information on it, and there is no information on this type of cement that exists in the United States in like 1965 or something, right? So he eventually finds that the part of the formula is built out of this certain rock that's only found in this quarry in upstate New York. And he goes to the city that this quarry is at, and he goes to the museum that is in the city, and he asks the guy, what is this concrete? And the guy says, oh, everyone knows about that concrete. It's Rosendale cement. You know, the base of the Statue of Liberty, the White House is made of this stuff. And this guy whose profession it is to restore monuments is like, buddy, no one on this planet knows what this stuff is. You're the only guy. And so if you're in New York in a sensitive area and you're running a museum, you're most likely it's a Freemason. So this guy's in on the whole thing and tries to tell this dude, tries to keep the story going, and tells this dude, everyone knows about Rosendale cement. Look up the story. It's real interesting. But you could literally go touch this stuff in your city if you find that it's on the list. Really weird story. But anyway, so yeah, Rosendale cement. Really, really interesting. Obviously, Wikipedia is going to be full of shit. And it's funny because there's no mention of that story I just told you. So before that guy figured out what this cement was, there was no one knew what Rosendale cement is, and it's now on Wikipedia because this guy found out about it, and there's no mention of him finding it on this because it's a part. It's a clue to the deception. But anyway, getting back to homie here.
And in other instances, being backfilled with dirt and turned into golf courses. But back to the reset. Does the reset matter? And if you're interested in survival, I suppose it does. And if you're interested in simple history, then it does as well. To me, it is clear there is a reset, what seems to be every 400 years.
And by reset, you mean complete extinction of the human race as it was to be replaced by a new set of humans, I think.
And
Straw man again. No, that's not what he's saying. There are many different types of resets, not just an extermination of an entire civilization. That's actually rarely happened in history. Even when you have war, you have refugees, half the fucking population leaves. So you rarely get a full-on extinction of an entire society. But that's not the type of reset that we're talking about. You can have cultural resets where a certain culture is wiped out or taken away from their land, or you can have people taken out of cities and separated and sent to different parts of the world with the rest of their other people. There's tons of different kinds of resets. You have resets, catastrophic resets that are like the Younger Dryas effect, which is something that is a big clue in on this whole Tartarian mud flood thing. Younger Dryas, 12,500 years ago, there was a massive ice cap that melted and basically wiped the entire North American continent, scraped off everything on it. And is probably a reason why a lot of these cities and a lot of these photos and a lot of these buildings have like a few meters of mud around them, is because we've been dealing with mud coming off mountains because of Younger Dryas for as long as we've been around, and it's still happening now. Even in LA, every time it rains, we have mudslides and mud going into people's houses and killing them. You know, we're still dealing with that. So back in the day, I'm sure they were dealing with it anymore. And if you have a reset where everyone's taken out of a city, or a catastrophic thing happens and the people of the city disappear and the city's left for 5, 10 years, 20 years, you're going to get mud built up in the city. Sorry. You're going to have floods that bring mud in. You're going to have, there's constantly dust falling out of, it's like, it's not going to be, you're not going to leave, you have these like Hollywood movies where they're like, oh, the city's been left for 25 years and it's like you can still walk on the streets and shit. No, like it gets overgrown. Dirt piles up, So, you have liquefaction, which is when something catastrophic happens, big earthquake, who knows, meteor, whatever. Liquefaction can screw up entire areas. In Brazil recently, there was an entire county that moved to the side like 200 yards. Just a dry area just liquefied and moved down the hill. These people that make it seem, oh, this mud flood is like this giant blob, like the old movie The Blob. The blob's coming and it's sucking up this city and killing everyone in the city. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about why do we find so many old photos where people are cleaning up dirt off of the street, mud, crap all over the streets in front of some of the most technologically advanced buildings I've ever seen in an era of depression when people were supposedly off. Miners were illiterate miners from all around, illiterate immigrant miners from all around the world were off in the gold fields, and somehow the city of San Francisco, 30-story skyscrapers built out of rock perfectly, brick, concrete, perfect, giant buildings somehow were made really quickly during the time around, none of this shit, Matt. It just doesn't make sense how they taught us in school. And if it makes sense to you, then this isn't going to be interesting to you. But if you see these things and you're like, wait a minute, then this is the rabbit hole for you, because this is one of the most fun rabbit holes I've ever been in. So when I see clods like this trashing it with their pure ignorance, it just drives me nuts.
Water and fire. Oftentimes the fire being a byproduct of what seems to be a plasma electrical
All those buildings are gone.
discharge.
And where did this discharge come from, John?
Right.
So, when John talks about electrical discharge, he's using one example of a catastrophic effect. When I go and hike in my local mountains, I look at the geology and there's very violent geology. Something did that. I don't know, it could have been a big wave, or it could have been a meteor, or it could have been a volcano, or an earthquake, or who knows, maybe something that we haven't experienced yet, like some sort of electric, like a lightning storm times 1,000, like something that just destroys the top of the layer of the earth. I know even some people believe in like what are those things called? Polar shifts, and there's all kinds of ridiculous and then quite reasonable reasons why you would have these catastrophic things happen. But all John's just using one example of one of the things people have speculated about. Again, when you have guys that like demand evidence. Give me evidence. Where's the proof? Like, if we had evidence or proof or some link that would convince you right off the bat, do you think we'd even be having this conversation? We're questioning the mainstream dialogue here. You can't debunk the mainstream dialogue with mainstream links, bruh. That's why we're looking at old photos and old movies and old maps and things, because we're trying to learn a different type of history from like more of a direct source than our elementary school books that they shoved down our throats when we were too young to critically think.
Around, causing canyons and melting cities overnight.
Wow, that sounds horrific. Any evidence to support that claim at all, John?
Here we go.
And in other cases, we see the results of massive flooding. And not only flooding that came from oceans in a horizontal direction, but waters that came from beneath, pushing up and displacing the land and causing new and varied elevations. In many cases, causing what we call mud flood to seemingly bury the lower levels.
I guarantee this guy has videos about UFOs and he thinks they're totally real, but he won't accept that maybe some catastrophic shit happened and that maybe our government has lied to us about how many civilizations existed in the country we live in before we were here. Like, that's not, when I see people that trust the government story these days, it's just like so mind-boggling. Or at least trust that everything the government says is true.
Of buildings.
And this is where we were with Barnabas Nagy. You remember him? He was the guy that tried to tell us all that basement windows were proof of a mud flood.
Okay, so again, not much context he's giving. So this guy, okay, so basement windows could be evidence of something, and also it's not just basement windows, it's stairways going up to second floors. They're very specific buildings that have these basement windows and second story floors. They're all very, very the most oldest buildings in our cities. He's not saying this is definitive proof. He's just saying it's a very strange and unusual and no longer practiced architectural aspect that may lend a little credibility to the fact that at some point these buildings were built and then they were left for a long time and shit built up, and instead of cleaning out everything, they just kind of built around it and dealt with it, thus by making stairs going up to a second story when normally you just walk into the building. Second story stairs don't make sense. Windows at floor level don't make any sense architecturally. You can kick it in and climb in really easy. If there's a flood, it's just a direct entry right into your house. they're not really done anymore for a reason. They're very strange, but, you know, we find footage, we find pictures of clearly windows going below sub-level. So, you know, maybe some of these buildings, some of these windows have been put there simply as basement windows, but some of them seem to have not. Some of them seem to have been buried, like the whole front of the building's buried. So,
in some cases, completely burying cities entirely. And we can see examples of this found everywhere. And this leads right into mud
like
flood.
here.
The mud flood is a mystery to us. Many different theories coming from all angles. And again, this could be the result of water, or it could be the result of this plasma discharge, this superheated event that renders matter and formerly buildings into what now looks like mud. And we see this everywhere, especially in the North American Southwest.
Okay, a place that is as far away from Tartaria as you can pretty much get. Gotcha.
So, funny he mentions that, because if you look at a lot of 15th, 16th, 17th century maps, you will see Tartaria, and you will see Tartaria reaching right into North America. So if this dill hole had spent more than 5 minutes researching this, he would know that, and he wouldn't look like such a dill hole right now.
But just so I'm understanding this correctly, a giant plasma electrical discharge turns the entire world's buildings and civilizations to mud.
Strawman number 4. No, that's not what he's saying at all. And even in the clip coming up, he explains that that's not what he's saying, but this douche doesn't even...
Right.
But in many cases, we do see mud flood in major cities with no sign of any heat damage. And when we look at these cataclysms with mud flood and plasma discharges pertaining to resets, the big question, once one begins to wrap one's head around this notion, is how do these resets occur?
Indeed. And where is the evidence to show that they occurred? And where are the facts to show that this was a plasma...
Why, if the powers that be staged a reset, why, how... You think there's just going to be links to, like, sufficient evidence laying around, you dill hole? So...
electrical discharge, all that the mud came from below.
Are these a product of man or none?
John is literally asking these questions. He's not saying this stuff is true or concrete facts. He's simply speculating. The whole video series is a speculation series.
Humanoid? Or is this more of a...
And again, this Simon Dan seems to think that we know everything about everything, and that everything is just a Google search away.
natural cycle? And I tend to believe that it is a cycle, again, every 400 years. And I have some very exciting research to share with you on that subject, but it deserves its own video.
Ah, that's a shame. Maybe we'll have to revisit John Levi again at some point.
And
Maybe you should have visited him before you made this video and made yourself look like a douche.
it's reminding me of a larger season, a grand cycle. Many cultures sharing these cycles, calendars and artifacts.
I can't help but notice like how open-minded and full of information John Levy is, and how closed-minded and how little information this guy has.
Left behind long after the people that made them disappeared. And it is clear that there's different resets. Again, the Native Americans tell us there have been 5. And this very last reset that seems to be 200 to 400 years ago, as I've mentioned in past videos, does not seem to be or have been as violent as prior resets.
200 to 400 years ago? Are you saying, John, that we're due one? We better all get on.
Juwan.
As violent as prior resets.
200 to 400 years ago? Are you saying, John, that we're due one?
Juwan. Do one.
We better all get our giant electrical plasma discharge sirens up and running then, haven't we?
No, Dick. That's not what he's saying. He's saying resets happen every 200 to 400 years. One reset happened after a catastrophic event which wiped out a civilization, maybe a war, maybe something Mother Nature dealt us. He's not saying that like clockwork every 400 years catastrophic things happen.
Prior resets turning structures, and some of the most massive structures, into unrecognizable, what we call mountain. And yet when we look at this past reset, we see the most beautiful architecture in the world.
Built without cranes, without electricity, without power tools, without Home Depots, without infrastructures for resources, natural resources, dirt, like clay and stuff that they need to build, without talent, skilled labor. All they had was illiterate immigrant miners with wheelbarrows, donkeys, and shovels, and they allegedly built all this stuff in like 10 years.
The same architecture used most often for government, capitol buildings, courthouses, post offices, and so many other municipalities. But not limited, the architecture from this past civilization and this past reset remains intact, built of the finest quality, built in a far superior fashion than anything we build today. And the buildings remain, and they are still so new looking that our people had the gall to write silly stories about them.
The gall? Sorry, John, I'm having a very, very hard time following this now. You have supplied no evidence or facts.
Here we go with the evidence and facts that they should just be like littering the world of this stuff. And the funny thing is, John's got a huge channel with literally tons and tons and tons and tons of videos with hours and hundreds of hours of research. Not I went to school and some older person told me it was true and I believe it. God.
Any of your claims. I've had a sneaky peek at the rest of John Levi's channel, and I have to say, it's a gold mine. We will be coming back here soon.
No, you probably won't, because you don't have an open enough mind to actually take things and consider them.
So don't worry.
You'll always just be a cheeky douchebag.
We definitely will be looking at John Levi again, but for now, that wraps up another Tinfoil Tuesday. Thank you all very much for watching.
Look, people, anyone tells you not to research everything, do not trust them.